Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today I got something very special I want to talk about. Now, not too long ago, I did a video for Sega about their 60th anniversary, specifically the Go Sega 60th anniversary campaign. They asked me to make a video about the history of every single one of their consoles, just kind of in a nutshell. And I was happy to do it. People seemed to really like it. And after, it went over pretty well, I went back to Sega and I was like, do you need anything else like that? And they were like, you know what would be kind of cool is talking about all the other random iterations of Sega hardware. So I was all over that idea. So thank you very much to Sega for reaching out once again to be involved with this. Very cool. So everybody wish Sega a happiest 60th anniversary. Now here's the thing. I talked about all these different consoles that Sega had, right? But I said at the beginning, I wasn't going to be talking about all the different iterations of Sega consoles because things, particularly the Sega Genesis, was so successful that the Genesis ended up having a lot of different versions of itself, and it was just impossible to cover all of them. I mean, none of these were in the previous video, and look at the table space. It would have just been completely impossible. And even now, this isn't even close to all of them. So a couple of ground rules before we go into each one of these consoles here, right? First, none of the ones that appeared in the previous video will be in this video. So like the Sega Genesis Model 1 and 2 are not in this video only because they were in that video. The Sega CD Model 1 and 2, not in this video because they were in that video, and so on. The only time I made exceptions for that in the previous one was simply when there was some reason behind it. Like the SG-1000 1 and 2 were special because the SG-1001 was the only American-made Sega console, and the SG-1002 was the first Japanese-made Sega console. And in the case of the Sega Genesis / Sega CD combo, you had to talk about them separately, and then when you combine them all, that was technically a separate console, so just for the aesthetics, you might as well just use the other versions. But that was really the only reason I made exceptions. And trust me when I say a lot of people wanted me to talk about the exceptions, so let's go ahead and do that. But couple of rules behind this. So first and foremost, this does not include any of the aftermarket consoles that Sega licensed, particularly with the Genesis, things made by At Games or whatever. My basic ground rule here is it has to be a console Sega either made themselves or they had it made while they were still in hardware, specifically console hardware. So that's ground rule number one. So that eliminates all those like clones and other random things. The other thing is I didn't include like regional difference versions. Like I have a Mega Drive Model 1 I have from both Europe and Japan, as well as a Genesis Model 1. I'm not doing that. I'm not including like limited edition versions that are different colors. None of that type of stuff, because you just have to keep it somewhat reasonable. You just do. But beyond that, I think I've included everything else that I have. So let's talk about the ones I know I don't have and that I would love to have, but I don't own. First and foremost, that would be the Sega Terra Drive. The Sega Terra Drive was actually a home computer released in Japan that actually included a Mega Drive slot on it, so you could play Mega Drive games on it. Big deal at the time. Now it would be very much a novelty. I would love to own one of these things, but the problem is I've never seen one for sale anywhere in Japan. And the only time I've ever even seen one was, I believe, Sega Fest in 2018 when Sega brought me out for that. They actually had one on display. I think that's the only time I've ever seen one of those in person. But very cool. And it's unfortunate it never got a release in North America, but it didn't. However, across the pond in the other direction, it sort of got a release. In the UK, Amstrad did a deal with Sega, and they released what was called the Mega PC. Also exactly the same concept. It was a home computer that had a Sega Mega Drive built into it. That I've also seen for sale in the UK, but logistics make that also just impossible to get back here because of how big it is, plus needing all the proprietary things that go along with it, and it wasn't going to happen. Actually, but Sega owns the fact that they made the Terra Drive. I mean, it's even on this shirt down here. However, the Amstrad one is a separate thing. It's just the same concept hit twice. We just never got that particular version. But both of those are very legit and very neat. Another one that they did that is very cool that I would like to have is they did a deal with a company called Iowa. Now, Iowa, you might have heard of. It's a sound company, so they make a lot of electronics. They used to make a lot of like boom boxes and CD players and things like that. And they made one called the Iowa Mega CD, and it only came out in Japan. And it was a Mega Drive and Sega CD as well as a portable boombox. I've seen one of those once. Ironically, I saw it in Paris, but I've seen one of those once. Outside of that, never seen it again. It's not a common device whatsoever. And then the last one that I can think of that I would really like to have that I have never had the chance to buy outside of once. I saw one at a Super Potato in Japan, but it was just too expensive to pull the trigger on, is something called the Mega Jet. Now, the Mega Jet is a portable version of the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive that was only released in Japan, but it was released there in a very limited capacity, as it was really only intended for airlines to use. It was a portable Genesis that didn't have a screen. So the idea was, if you were flying on this plane, you could bring your games along, and the airline would kind of provide the Mega Jet for you. You'd connect it to their little TV screen, and you just play your Mega Drive games on the flight. That was the basic logic there. Today, it's a very neat little thing to have, but it's very prohibitively expensive. Outside of that, the only other things that come to mind are things like the Pico, which I talked about in my previous video, is the child development video game console. Sega actually did a lot of versions of that look completely different. I don't have any of those, and they're just slight iterations and slight changes. They're cool, but I just don't have any of them. And they're also huge, if you saw the Pico I had before. So one day, who knows, maybe. But now, let's move on. Let's talk about the ones that are actually sitting in front of me. Oh wait, there's one other exception to that, and because I know somebody will bring it up if I don't. The Sega SC3000. The SC3000 was another version of the Sega SG1000. It was their home computer version. It came out on the exact same day as the SG1000 in Japan, and was just a personal computer that also played video games, specifically the SG1000 games. But while I would love to own one of those, and I actually had the chance in Japan to get a nice one. Oh, it killed me. I was there. There was a store. They had it all boxed up, and they had like all the things with it. It wasn't even all that expensive. I mean, it wasn't cheap, but it wasn't as expensive as it should have been. I just couldn't get it because it was just logistically impossible. Like, I would have needed like 2 more suitcases to bring it back. It just wasn't going to happen. But that killed me. But that'll about do it for all the ones I don't have. So let's talk about the ones I actually do. Now, starting back in our history lesson, going back to the beginning after SG-1000, talked about that, then talked about the Master System. So I talked about the Mark III, talked about the Master System Model 1. One thing I didn't talk about was the Master System Model 2. Now, the Master System Model 2 is a more uncommon version of the Master System, particularly because I believe it never really got released in Japan, and in North America it's very uncommon. However, if you're screaming at screaming at YouTube right now, being like, I have one, you're probably in Europe, because this was actually very common over there, particularly in the UK. In the UK, I've seen these all the time. But outside of there, not so much. In the UK, well, probably in all of Europe, the design is actually black. Unlike this is gray, because this is the North American version. Now, so that said, it did actually come out here, and it's not a bad design. It's got this little dust cover thing going on front, says Master System 2 on it, has the pause button, the power button, does not play the little card games, but aside from that, it's essentially the same device, and it does have some internal games built into it. Unfortunately, on the back, it only offers RF out instead of any sort of better option. But so now it's just a novelty. Interestingly, though, if you are in North America and you want to get one of these, and this is more advice for Americans in particular, if you're like, hey man, I want to get that, but I've never seen one before, you're not alone. If you go online and try to get the North American version, I will bet you most of the time where you're going to find it is Canada. I don't entirely know why, but in Canada they seem to get a lot more of these. Mine I got in Wisconsin. Now, whether or not it made its way down from Canada to Wisconsin at some point, I don't know. But either way, I know I bought mine on US soil, but most of the time when I was ever searching for it, I could only find them in Canada. Go figure. So that was it for the Master System. And then we get on to the Genesis, or Mega Drive. And as I mentioned before, the Mega Drive / Genesis by far had the most like mutant iterations. I mean, we already talked about more than most consoles ever get. And yet, that's not even half of them. So let's talk about the ones we have, starting with the one that was by far the most demanded in that video, and that would be the Sega Nomad. Now, I swear to you, on that previous video, like 1 out of every 3 comments was, where is the Nomad? Or you forgot the Nomad. What about Nomad? Okay. In that video, in my defense, I said right at the beginning, I wasn't going to be including other iterations of Sega hardware, like consoles that already existed. So I covered the Genesis. There really was no reason to talk about the Nomad, because then I start making exceptions for that. Then I got to start including everything, and it just spirals out of control. It's chaos. But now's the time to talk about it. Yes, the Sega Nomad, a very unique version of the Sega Genesis. A truly portable version, unlike, say, the Mega Jet, this one actually had a full screen. This also is unique because it was only released in North America. This never came out in Japan, and this never came out in Europe. It's cool, but a lot of people get kind of upset because they think of it as Sega's like next-gen portable device, when it really wasn't. It was actually made very late into the Sega Genesis life, more or less to keep the Genesis alive. And it was just kind of like, let's try shifting it to a different market. It wasn't really meant to be like, hey, we'll go head-to-head with Nintendo on the Game Boy Advance or anything like that. Granted, they were like 5 years apart, but like it wasn't meant for that. It was just like a way to keep the Genesis alive, because it's a full-on Sega Genesis. It even has a second controller port at the bottom. It has AV out. It actually supports RGB out. It has an external power supply. Like you can connect this to a television and not skip a beat. You can just keep playing your games as if they were plugged into your television already. But then you have the ability to be on the go. Now, of course, it drains batteries like crazy, but you know, they did offer these battery packs and all sorts of stuff, so you could definitely use it if you were so inclined. It's a very, very neat little thing. But yeah, so because of that, it's just a Sega Genesis, though. It doesn't include like 32X support, or even the no Sega CD support, obviously, and even like the Master System adapter doesn't really like work on this. So it's really just a Genesis, but it's a very cool version of the Genesis, I must admit. But we're not even close to done. There are so many other versions of the Genesis. Let's start here with the Sega Wondermega. This was released in Japan. Sega made this as basically a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive and Mega CD combo. It also doubled as a karaoke device, because we can never underestimate the popularity of karaoke in Japan. It has a motorized disc tray. I've never seen that on any other device. Like, you see ejecting disc trays, sure, but this is a flip top, but it's motorized, which is strange. It's a very cool device, and it has some proprietary ports on the back. This is actually, as far as I know, the only version of the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive to have S-Video natively on board, which is pretty cool. If you wanted to use that, although typically I would just use RGB, but it is very cool. Now, they actually did a couple of different versions of this. This is just one of them, where the wording slightly changes. They did a couple of small cosmetic differences, but primarily this was your Sega Wondermega. Now, they eventually did a complete redesign of the Sega Wondermega that they re-released in Japan, and then they eventually brought that re-release model over here with just a couple of additional changes, and I have that. It is called, over here, the JVC X-Eye. JVC, also known as Victor. Sega actually did a lot of different partnerships with JVC over the years to make certain special editions of the Sega Saturn and so on and so forth, but they were just essentially repaints, whereas this is like a full-on body design difference. Once again, this is a Sega Genesis and a Sega CD in one. This, being the American version, uses like traditional controller ports, whereas the Japanese version seemed to use wireless controllers and referred to itself as the Wondermega, not so much the JVC X-Eye concept. But this one actually has the spacing for an S-Video port, but is not actually on there. I think the Japanese version does in fact have the S-Video port. This is compatible with the 32X, however, it would, if you had the 32X on there, the disc tray would not eject. So you would need that. But once again, karaoke was in mine. In fact, mine actually came with a karaoke disc of the Beatles for some reason. But regardless, it's a very cool little device. Now, even though those existed, Sega was not done trying to fuse the Genesis and the Sega CD into different things. They released this. This is one of the more popular and sought-after ones because people like it for the compact design. This is the Sega CDX or Genesis CDX. This was actually also released not only in North America, but it came out in Europe as the Sega Multi-Mega. This never actually came out in Japan. Now, this is a very cool design. It's much smaller. People seem to really like this one, particularly because compared to a lot of the other versions of the combination of the Genesis and Sega CD, this doesn't take up much real estate. And it does support the 32X, so it's very neat. Now, as cool as this is, it actually was another one of these things where Sega was kind of trying to attempt to crack different markets. So in this case, what they did was they thought, at the time, you know what was popular? Portable CD players. So why don't we sell you guys a portable CD player? You can use it, you can take it around, on your travels, whatever you're doing, going to school, what have you. But then when you get home, plug it in because it's going to play your Sega Genesis games and your Sega CD games. That's one of the reasons this thing is so neat. It actually has a battery component, set on the back there. You put in 2 AA batteries, and boom, you're playing portable music on the go. It's a very 90s idea, but it's a very cool little device. And I know a lot of people who really seek those out. Very awesome. Yet, in another attempt to get into other markets, you can see this giant behemoth underneath. This is the Pioneer Laseractive. I actually did an entire video on this thing. This was technically made by Pioneer, not by Sega, but Sega definitely authorized its existence. It allows you, with a certain game pack that's plugged in currently, to be able to play Sega Genesis and, once again, Sega CD games. What it primarily is, though, is a Laserdisc player. If anybody remembers that format, and I'm sure a lot of you do, it plays Laserdisc movies. It also has its own proprietary games that only work if you have the Sega Genesis or Sega Genesis pack in there. Which is also very cool, meaning there are games exclusively kind of using Sega CD/Genesis hardware that only work on this thing. But really, at the end of the day, its best catalog of titles comes from having the Sega Genesis compatibility and the Sega CD compatibility. It is worth noting, though, that it also does support TurboGrafx 16 and TurboGrafx 16 CD games, provided you have that expansion pack, which unfortunately I do not. But that said, to me, it's just a really big version of the Sega CD and Sega Genesis. So with all those oddities out of the way, there is one last one that people bring up from time to time, which is this, the Sega Genesis Model 3. This one is very interesting to me because some could argue by the definition I gave towards the beginning of this video about how Sega had to make it themselves and it had to be relevant when they were dealing with that console. This might not necessarily qualify. This was licensed by Sega. It came out while they were making hardware, although it didn't come out while they were making Genesis hardware anymore. This was actually made by a company called Majesco. They released their own version of the Sega Genesis with Sega's permission. Now, Sega was still making consoles, they just weren't focused on the Genesis anymore. This came out very late in the 90s. I think the Dreamcast was either out or just about to come out. But with this thing, this is the version of the console, to be honest, that most people tend to avoid. They like the cosmetic of it. It's small, it's compact, it'll play all your Genesis games for the most part. It doesn't play Virtua Racing. But it also doesn't support the 32X or the Sega CD. So it's strictly just a Genesis minus the Virtua Racing compatibility. But very basic, very compact design, and it's cool. Like that they kind of went out with this. This is before it got into the other traditional clones that we know now, which are not full-on hardware. They're basically just digital replications on a single chip called an NOAC, or at least that's what they've been commonly become known as. But anyway, regardless, this one was made, or at least directly involved with, by Sega. However, Majesco and Sega's relationship was not over there. They also did this. This is debatable whether or not we should even really be counting it, but I'm just throwing it in here because why not? This is the Sega Game Gear, as I mentioned in the previous video as well. The difference is this is the Majesco version. Majesco, again, released this in the late 90s. It was a complete re-release of the Game Gear. Now, they used the same shell. They didn't redesign it. The only thing they really did differently is they changed some of the coloring. So the Game Gear logo is just gray. It doesn't have multiple colors. The start button is no longer blue. It's more of a purple. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The black on the device is also a slightly different degree of black. But aside from that, it is the same thing. This is actually funny because this is the first version of the Game Gear I ever owned. I remember buying this really late in the 90s, being stunned. I walked into a Toys R Us and I was like, they have a Game Gear in the box? What is going on? Because I remember my cousins having that like in the early 90s, so I didn't know what was happening. I just bought it out of excitement. So very cool, and then I still have it, of course. Works great. But yeah, so moving on, we also can talk, of course, about the Sega Saturn. Now, the Sega Saturn really only had, well, it had 3 versions. 3. I talked about the Model 1 already in the previous video, and again, we're not talking about all the insane amount of limited edition versions. We're also not talking about, say, the Hitachi versions or the Victor versions, because they are essentially the exact same molding. More or less, they're just different colors. So there's the Model 2, which I have sitting here right in front of me. Now, what they did with this is they had the power button and the open button, as well as the reset button redesigned. So the original had ovals. This has round buttons, and it also had a load light originally. They removed that. This was primarily done to basically bring costs down a little bit on production. They could save on it, getting to remove one of the lights and just kind of cover it up with plastic. So it allowed them to do a redesign that could bring the cost down a little bit, but essentially that's all it did. At least in North America, where both versions, cosmetically speaking, look almost identical. If you look at the Japanese versions, it's like a really stark difference because of the colors. Now, I did say there was a third one, and there is. It's often forgotten, even by me, which is the Hitachi version, not the two I mentioned before, but there's a third Hitachi version I do not own, but I do know a guy who owns one of those, and it's a full-on redesign of the Sega Saturn that actually had a built-in GPS. It was designed for cars. Really cool, and I've held one. It's neat. Don't own one. I've never had the opportunity to buy one or anything like that, but it is very cool that it exists, so I thought I would bring it up now. So the last one that I'm going to bring up here in this particular video, I think, is the one that probably caught your eye the most and that I haven't even glanced at. Boom! The Divers 2000 Sega Dreamcast. Yes, this is a Sega Dreamcast. Up there, that's the disk drive. It is a Japanese Sega Dreamcast built into a television. This is a tiny little CRT television that, this came out in Japan in very limited quantities. Supposedly, I've heard this multiple times, and I've said it a couple of times, because it's the only source I've got on it, that only 200 of these were ever produced. I bought one years ago when nobody cared about what it is. Today, these are fetching ridiculous numbers if you can find one. In fact, most of the time, if you ever want to look it up, the only stories you'll find about it are videos I've already done on it. Like, I've done 2 videos on this thing. If you want to see the greater details on it, by all means, I invite you to check that out. But that and the Pioneer Laseractive I did a video on as well. But the rest of this, some of which is yet to come. But yeah, that's an entire Japanese Dreamcast inside of a tiny little weird TV. But there you go. That's just a quick look at some of the various Sega console iterations that were not in the original video, as well as obviously there's omissions that I mentioned but I don't own. And I'm sure people will be like, well, what about this? You could be completely right. There's so many strange versions of Sega hardware out there, console hardware, that I might just be missing, and I would love to hear about those in the comments. So please, if you could include that, that would be great. Also, everybody, let's just take a second to wish Sega a happy 60th birthday. Very awesome. They're still around, and they're still, you know, doing great things and making great games. I'm very excited about for what they continue to offer. So thank you very much to them for the opportunity to be involved in this. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you guys could check out the description and look at all the social media stuff, follow me on there, what have you. Like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate all that. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.